The air was thick with tension as the sun rose over London on August 24, 1662. It was St. Bartholomew's Day, and the city was on edge. Many feared that this day would mark the beginning of a new rebellion, one that could plunge England back into the chaos of the civil wars. The streets were unusually quiet, but the silence was heavy, filled with whispers of dissent and the clatter of soldiers preparing for action. In the parish church of St. Alphege, London Wall, a congregation gathered for their Sunday service, unaware of the storm that was about to break. The rector, Thomas Doolittle, had already fled, but a substitute preacher stood in his place, determined to hold the service. Suddenly the doors burst open, and a company of soldiers stormed in, their boots pounding on the wooden floor. "Stop the service," the officer shouted, his voice echoing through the church. "I command you, in the king's name, to come down from that pulpit." The congregation, a mix of angry and frightened faces, stood their ground. The substitute preacher, undaunted, replied with a defiance that startled the soldiers. "I command you, in the name of the King of Kings, not to disturb his worship, but let me go on." For a moment the church was silent, the tension palpable. Then the officer gave a sharp command, and the soldiers raised their weapons. The congregation erupted into chaos, people rushing to protect the preacher. In the confusion, the preacher managed to slip away, but the soldiers were relentless. They arrested several parishioners and dragged them out of the church. This was just one of many confrontations that day, but it was a clear sign of the growing conflict between the government and the dissenters. The Act of Uniformity, passed in May 1662, had required all clergymen to conform to the Anglican liturgy and denounce the Presbyterian covenant. Those who refused were to be ejected from their churches on St. Bartholomew's Day. Nearly 1,000 nonconforming ministers were expected to lose their positions, and the government was determined to enforce the law. The Great Ejection, as it came to be known, passed with fewer outright rebellions than feared, but the tension remained. Dissenters, now thrown out of the national church, continued their activities in secret, forming conventicles unlawful religious gatherings. The government, led by King Charles II, saw these conventicles as a threat to the stability of the realm and moved quickly to suppress them. In 1664, the Conventicle Act was passed, making it a crime to attend these gatherings. The act placed the responsibility for enforcing the law on local magistrates, who often called on the military for help. The small standing army, known as the Guards and Garrisons, was tasked with breaking up these meetings and arresting the participants. One such operation took place in the town of Sherborne, Dorset. On September 19, 1662, a group of soldiers interrupted a service led by Baptist minister Francis Bampfield. They arrested Bampfield, another minister, and 25 attendees, dragging them off to jail. The conditions in these jails were harsh, and many dissenters suffered physical abuse and neglect. The violence and brutality of these enforcement actions were not isolated incidents. In 1663, soldiers in Essex beat Quakers with clubs, some of which had iron spikes, leaving them severely injured. Another Quaker, Henry Foster, was arrested, and his pregnant wife was threatened with pistols and swords, leading to a premature birth and the death of both mother and child. The use of soldiers to enforce religious conformity was not just a matter of law, it was a show of force. The government wanted to send a clear message: dissent would not be tolerated. But the dissenters, driven by their faith and a sense of injustice, refused to be silenced. In the northern counties, radical dissenters, many of them veterans of the Civil War, plotted and rebelled against the government. In 1663, there were several insurrections, and in the early 1680s, the Rye House Plot and Monmouth Rebellion further strained the relationship between the government and the dissenters. The fear of sedition and rebellion only intensified the government's resolve to crack down on conventicles. By the end of the 1660s, the fear of a standing army, which many saw as a tool of tyranny, had begun to take root. The small English army, while effective in suppressing dissent, was not the same as the large, professional armies of continental Europe. However, the threat of a larger, more permanent military force loomed large in the minds of many, especially as King Charles II attempted to expand his army in the 1670s. The tension between the government and the dissenters continued to simmer, and the use of soldiers to enforce religious conformity remained a contentious issue. But as the years passed, the radical elements within the dissenting communities began to weaken. The fear of a full-scale dragonade, like those that had occurred in France, never fully materialized in England. Instead, the persecution of dissenters took on a more local and sporadic nature, with soldiers often working alongside local officials to enforce the law. Despite the ongoing tensions, the stage was set for a significant shift in the religious landscape of England. The events of St. Bartholomew's Day and the years that followed would have far-reaching consequences, shaping the future of religious freedom and the relationship between church and state in the years to come. In the years following the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, the government in Scotland faced a significant challenge from religious dissenters, particularly the Presbyterians. The new king, Charles II, wanted to restore the episcopal form of church governance, which meant that bishops would have authority over the church, replacing the Presbyterian system where local churches were self-governed. To enforce this change, about one-third of the Presbyterian ministers were removed from their posts. Many of these ministers and their followers, especially in the southwestern regions of Scotland, such as Ayrshire, Dumfriesshire, and Galloway, refused to accept the new system. They began holding secret meetings, known as conventicles, in private homes, barns, and even in open fields. These meetings became a major concern for the Scottish authorities, who saw them as a threat to the king's authority and the new religious order. In 1662, the Parliament of Scotland passed a law that banned these unlawful meetings and conventicles, and made it illegal for anyone to preach without the permission of the local bishop. Unlike similar laws in England, this Scottish law did not provide clear guidelines on how to enforce it, but the authorities still took action. The small Scottish army was often used to break up these meetings, much like how the English army dealt with dissenters in England. However, the Scottish soldiers had additional responsibilities that were not common in England. They were allowed to impose fines directly on people who missed church services or attended conventicles. If the offenders couldn't pay, the soldiers would sometimes take their Bibles, clothes, or other valuable items. This practice, known as the bishop's dragnet, was a harsh way to enforce religious conformity. Another unique method used in Scotland was the billeting of soldiers in the homes of those who resisted the new religious order. This meant that soldiers would be housed in the homes of people who attended conventicles or refused to accept the new bishops. This was a form of punishment and a way to pressure these individuals into compliance. The practice was similar to the later French dragonnades, where Huguenots, French Protestants, faced similar treatment. The harsh measures taken by the soldiers often led to abuse and corruption. For example, when a farmer named Grier was arrested and his corn confiscated, it sparked a rebellion in 1666. A group of Presbyterians led by a veteran named Wallace captured Sir James Turner, a military commander known for his brutality. The rebels, who grew to over 1,000 strong, marched towards Edinburgh, but they were eventually defeated by a larger army led by General Thomas Dalyell at Rullion Green. Despite this setback, the government continued to face resistance. In 1670, another conventicle act was passed, but it proved ineffective as the conventicles only grew larger and more frequent. In 1677, the government tried a new approach by requiring tenants to sign bonds guaranteeing their religious conformity. When this failed, 6,000 Highland soldiers were sent to the western regions to enforce the law, but they were only there for a short time and caused little damage. The situation came to a head in 1679, when a large group of armed Covenanters, Presbyterian rebels, defeated government forces at Drumclog, but were later crushed at Bothwell Bridge. The government's response was to intensify its crackdown, leading to a period known as the Killing Time in the 1680s, where the death penalty was introduced for those who preached at conventicles. Despite the government's efforts, the resistance continued. In 1679, a group of Covenanters assassinated James Sharp, the Archbishop of St. Andrews, and launched another rebellion. In 1688, local people in Galloway even rescued a field minister from soldiers and killed 6 of them in the process. The turning point came in 1689, when William of Orange, a Dutch Calvinist prince, was offered the crown of Scotland. The new government, in its claim of right, prohibited the use of soldiers as judges and the deployment of the army against any part of the kingdom. This effectively ended the use of soldiers to enforce religious conformity. The following year, the Episcopalian system was abolished, and the Presbyterian form of church governance was restored. The story of the Scottish Covenanters shows how the government's attempts to enforce religious conformity through military force were ultimately unsuccessful. The resistance was too strong, and the government's brutal methods only fueled more opposition. In the end, it took a new political and religious settlement to bring peace to Scotland. Richard Sibbes, a moderate Puritan, believed that everyone pursued their desires with a kind of violence, a wholehearted and earnest effort. Religion didn't reduce this violence, it redirected it. To enter the kingdom of heaven, one must be spiritually violent, but this violence should not be unjust or iniquitous. People of God should not be violent in the sense of causing harm. This distinction was crucial, especially since taking a life unjustly was a grave matter. In 1644, Griffith Williams, a royalist chaplain and Bishop of Ossory, thought that eminent Puritan divines would be damned for leading the nation into an unjust and unholy war. They were accused of pointing the sword at their sovereign, which wounded their own souls. Despite Sibbes's earlier views, many Puritans justified armed rebellion and even executed their king. The line between righteous killing and spiritual suicide was blurred, depending on one's interpretation of justice and providence. The Puritans, often called the godly, engaged in what they considered godly violence in three senses. It was performed by the godly, believed to be godly, and involved God as an active participant. This chapter explores how the godly understood God's will and agency in war, a concept called military providentialism, and how they saw certain acts of killing as just and holy, termed godly or righteous violence. For example, the Rev. Thomas Shepard described the massacre of Pequot men, women, and children as divine slaughter by the hand of the English. Another New England minister encouraged his congregation to support war through deadly fastings and prayer, calling the godly murderers that will kill point blank from one end of the world to the other. This chapter focuses on the beliefs and actions of groups, rather than individual acts of violence. The characters in this historical investigation are long gone, but their story is viewed from a modern perspective. Scholars today study violence to understand and prevent it. Their work on modern violence influences how we approach historical violence, especially in avoiding overly simplistic explanations. This chapter argues for a complex understanding of the relationship between justice and holiness in conflict. If we only look at why the godly thought their violence was holy, we might miss why they thought it was just. Conversely, understanding why they thought violence was just can give deeper insights into why they believed it was holy. The just war tradition in Christian thought is complex and has a long history. However, a significant turn in thinking about this tradition came from Roland Bainton's influential 1942 paper, which was later included in a 1960 book. Bainton's work introduced a clear distinction between just war and holy war. In his section on the English Civil War, Bainton wrote, "The Puritans, unlike the Catholics, did not call their war a holy war. They spoke of it as a just war, and they believed that God would vindicate their cause. They did not think of themselves as fighting for God, but as fighting for justice, which they believed to be God's cause. This distinction is crucial. The Puritans saw their violence as just and necessary, not as a holy war in the traditional sense. They believed that God was on their side, but their primary focus was on the righteousness of their cause." This chapter delves into how the Puritans justified their actions and the role of religious belief in their understanding of justice and holiness. By exploring these complexities, we can gain a deeper understanding of the motivations and beliefs that drove the Puritans to engage in what they considered just and holy warfare. This approach helps us see the multifaceted nature of religious violence in the 17th century and its relevance to contemporary discussions on religion and conflict. In the 17th century, the lines between just and holy warfare were often blurred. People like Richard Bainton and James Turner Johnson have tried to define these lines, but their ideas have been both influential and controversial. Bainton believed that a holy war must be fought for a holy cause, usually religious, fought with God's help, fought by godly people against ungodly enemies, fought without mercy. Johnson criticized these criteria, saying they weren't very useful. Many Christian wars, he argued, claimed to be holy but also just. The term unsparingly in Bainton's criteria is too vague, and Johnson pointed out that religious warriors often tried to act justly and show restraint. To better understand the relationship between just and holy warfare, it helps to think of them on a spectrum. Mark Allman's book, Who Would Jesus Kill?, presents a single spectrum from pacifism to just war to holy war. However, this can be misleading because it suggests that the more holy a war is, the less just it must be. Instead, we need two separate spectrums, one for justice and one for holiness. On the justice spectrum, a war can be seen as either very just or not just at all. On the holiness spectrum, a war can be described using either very religious or very secular language. This allows for a war to be both just and holy, or neither. William Gouge, a Puritan minister, is often cited as an example of someone who believed in holy war. However, scholars like Barbara Donegan and Matthew Muehlbauer argue that Gouge actually stayed within the just war tradition. Gouge believed that war, if conducted lawfully, would not bring divine displeasure. This shows that even those who spoke about holy war often also talked about justice. Oliver Cromwell is another figure often associated with religiously motivated war. Rachel Foxley, a historian, argues that Cromwell believed gods will complemented a just cause. Cromwell's deeply religious views didn't mean he ignored justice. Instead, he saw them as working together. Samuel Noel, often seen as a just war advocate, used biblical language to justify his views. Roger Williams, known for promoting religious freedom, also supported many wars that he considered just. Williams believed that a war could be righteous and still be conducted in a lawful manner. John Morrill, a historian, famously argued that the English Civil War was the last of the wars of religion. This means that religion played a crucial role in the conflict, not just as a cover for political issues, but as a central factor. Religious beliefs and interpretations of Scripture were load-bearing, meaning they were essential to understanding the war. During times of war, people's beliefs often shifted. Fear and uncertainty could lead to a stronger reliance on religious interpretations. For example, many Puritans turned to the Hebrew Bible and the Book of Revelation for guidance. They saw spiritual warfare as supporting and even justifying actual warfare. This shift influenced how they used Scripture and theology. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 is often seen as a turning point that reduced religious warfare. However, religion continued to play a role in warfare, especially in the United States, where Christianity and patriotism are often intertwined. Even today, some people see God's hand in warfare, though such views are less common in public discourse. To truly understand the violence of the 17th century, we need to see it as meaningful. Most killers made strong claims about justice and holiness. This godly violence was deeply rooted in their beliefs about God, human nature, and the world around them. The use of religious language in warfare was normal, and only by recognizing this can we begin to understand the different ways it was used. The relationship between just and holy warfare is complex. Instead of seeing them as opposites, we should see them as overlapping. This helps us understand the beliefs and actions of people like Gouge, Cromwell, Noel, Williams, and many others. Their views on war were shaped by their beliefs about justice, holiness, and God's role in the world. When we look at the British Civil Wars, we see a complex mix of religious, political, and social factors that drove people to take up arms. Sarah Mortimer's work helps us understand that for many, the lines between holy and just causes were often blurred. The parliamentarians, who were strongly influenced by their religious beliefs, saw their fight as both a holy and just cause. They believed that their actions were not only morally right, but also divinely sanctioned. Some argued that the holiness of their cause was the foundation of its justice. They believed that because their actions were aligned with God's will, they were inherently just. This view, while less common, can be seen in the writings of figures like Thomas Munzer, who believed that the godly had a divine right to eliminate the ungodly. For Munzer, the justice of the cause was derived directly from its holiness. However, the more common view was that the cause was holy because it was just. This perspective, which scholars call the compatibilist view, held that the war was just because it was in response to real and grave injustices. The godly believed that their actions were in line with both God's will and the principles of justice. They saw their fight as a way to defend the innocent, protect their rights, and restore order. This view was more widely accepted, and is evident in the writings of many parliamentarian leaders like Oliver Cromwell and William Gouge. The idea of victimization played a crucial role in how these conflicts were justified. The godly often saw themselves as victims of oppression and believed that they had a moral duty to resist and fight back. This sense of being wronged by others, whether by the monarchy, the church, or foreign powers, provided a strong motivation for taking up arms. It also helped them see their enemies as the true perpetrators, which made it easier to justify the violence. Religious beliefs could both inhibit and enable violence. On one hand, the godly placed a high value on human life and believed in the importance of justice and mercy. They often cited religious texts to argue for restraint and humane treatment of enemies. For example, Peter Sterry, a prominent preacher, expressed his deep concern for the souls of even his enemies, showing a profound respect for human life. On the other hand, the same religious beliefs could also fuel violence. When the godly felt that their cause was just and that they were fighting for a higher purpose, they could justify extreme actions. The idea that their struggle was a divine mission could lead to a sense of righteous anger, making it easier to engage in violent acts. This paradox is evident in the actions of figures like Cromwell, who, after much self-examination, felt compelled to execute King Charles I in the name of justice. The history of the godly warriors during the British Civil Wars is a reminder that religious beliefs can have complex and sometimes contradictory effects. They can inspire people to act with great compassion and restraint, but they can also lead to intense conflicts and violence. The key lies in how these beliefs are interpreted and applied. When the godly saw their cause as both holy and just, it could lead to a more restrained and principled approach to warfare. However, when the sense of divine mission overwhelmed their sense of justice, it could result in devastating consequences. In the end, the story of the godly warriors is a cautionary tale. It shows us that the line between holy and just causes is often thin, and that the way we interpret our beliefs can have profound impacts on our actions. It also reminds us that true justice and holiness require a constant balance of compassion, self-reflection, and a commitment to the greater good.